Hello, everyone.
Can we have the mic on, please?
Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Clean Energy Connections. Esther Siskin here from Solar One. We're really happy to see all of you here tonight. Clean Energy Connections is produced by New York City Acre, Green Tech Media, and Solar One. We're really excited about tonight's event. The timing couldn't be better. Just 2 days ago, Governor Cuomo and NYSERDA released their Offshore Wind Master Plan, and that plan is a roadmap for reaching the state's goal of 2.4 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. So congratulations, NYSERDA, on the plan. We're really happy and lucky to have Doreen Harris of NYSERDA tonight on the panel. I also want to give a big shout out to NYSERDA. They are a longtime partner on sponsoring the Clean Energy Connections events. The Clean Energy Connections events are funded through a NYSERDA program called Clean Energy Communities. There's a lot of CEC acronyms there. Clean Energy Communities works with municipalities around New York State to implement high-impact actions to reduce energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. So thank you, NYSERDA. There are quite a few folks from NYSERDA here tonight. So if you stay for the networking portion of this event after the panel, you'll get to meet them and ask them questions about offshore wind and any of their other programs. For those of you who are not familiar with Solar One, we are a leading environmental education organization here in New York City. We provide education and technical assistance to help New York City be more sustainable and resilient and a more sustainable place to work and live. And let's see, how many folks here have been to Clean Energy Connections in the past? Great, well, welcome back. And how many of you are first-timers? Great, well, that's really wonderful that there are so many first-timers tonight. We hope to see you come back to more events. This event is also being live streamed, so welcome to our online audience. And I just have 2 housekeeping items to mention. If you have a question for the panel, there are index cards. Write your question on an index card, and there will be people walking up and down the aisles to collect them and to hand them to our moderator, Dan Shrieve. And also, this event is being filmed, so if you can keep background noise to a minimum and try not to knock over those beer bottles. And with that, I'd like to introduce Pat Sapinsley of New York City Acre, our wonderful longtime partner on Clean EC.
Thank you so much, Esther. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate your coming out on such a freezing cold night. We didn't mention cell phone usage. Our cell phone ringers, please shut them off. It is being live streamed. So I'm Pat Sapinsley. I run not only the Acre Incubator, but the Urban Future Lab at NYU Tendon School of Engineering. We are the center of gravity for all things clean tech in New York. We run educational programs such as this. We run the Clean Start program for career changers who wish to come into clean energy professions and need to learn more about it. You can find that on our website, ufl.nyc. You can also see our other programs. PowerBridge is a program that helps to take IP out of 6 downstate universities and scale it up into commercial companies. And we also run the Acre Incubator, as Esther mentioned, where we're now incubating 17 companies who all have market-ready solutions to fight climate change. We're also currently running a competition where we are narrowing down a couple of hundred applicants from all over the world, 22 countries. We're narrowing them down to 3 winners who will each get a $50,000 prize each. We got 150 from BP and New York Community Trust and NYSERDA. And those companies will then come into the incubator. So we will have 3 terrific world-class companies soon. Look for an announcement on February 23rd about who those companies are. So that's Urban Future Lab. I too want to thank NYSERDA, who funds not only Esther's program, not only this event that we always do together, but also the Urban Future Lab. So thank you, NYSERDA, for everything you've done. And thank you for this terrific study that came out just in time for our event. Wasn't that nice of Governor Cuomo? The role of offshore wind is going to be very important in New York State's energy future, and in this country's energy future. I think this publication has been more well-researched than many others across the world. I think New York will not only be a world leader in offshore wind due to this publication, but also a leader worldwide, countrywide and worldwide in offshore wind. It's been 2 years of research, countless meetings with stakeholders. NYSERDA is also funding workforce development to the tune of $15 million for approximately 5,000 jobs at various stages of the project. So it's been extremely well thought out. You'll hear more about it now. And I want to introduce our moderator who can tell you more about it. This is Dan Shrieve. He's a partner at Make Consulting, which is a Wood Mackenzie company. He has great expertise in wind, and he will introduce our panel after a few words about the project.
Great. Thanks so much to Pat and Esther for having me. Thanks for Clean Energy Connections for inviting us to moderate this panel. As you mentioned, my name is Dan Shrieve, partner at the former May Consulting. Group is now, as mentioned, part of the Wood Mackenzie Power and Renewables Group, working alongside Green Tech Media. The group together now looking to provide a full perspective on our energy future. And what the topic today, we're going to talk about offshore wind here in the United States. We'll talk a little bit about the global offshore wind market as well, just to provide a little bit of perspective about what's happening in some of the more mature markets where offshore has done quite well for itself and where the future may lie ahead of us here in the United States. So with that, if you can bring up the slide deck. Whoops, didn't want that to happen. So just waiting that to come up. Right, great, thank you. So, again, try that one more time. Just as we're bringing that up, there's a few key items that we're going to want to key upon when we're talking about the global offshore sector. Part of it is when we start talking about where the market has come from in the last few years. We start talking about the onset of auctions, competitive bidding systems throughout the world through renewable energies of all sorts, onshore wind, solar power. That's just not going to work, guys. Solar power. And we started off in Latin America. We saw some impressive pricing. When we start talking about solar, we start talking about onshore wind. We're looking at levelized costs of electricities that just were plummeting right before our eyes. And then how quickly it spread throughout the entire world, the Middle East and Africa, India, Germany. And then it went to the offshore markets, Germany, the Netherlands, talking about zero subsidy bids popping up. No, it's not going to work. You guys could flip the...
The green one there?
Yeah, that's the one.
Yep.
Yeah, try this one. Okay, great. So as mentioned, the dropping auction prices. We saw our first zero subsidy bids happening in Germany and now in the Netherlands. Just gives you an idea of how far the industry has come. We were talking about trying to get under Euro 100 per megawatt hour power for the offshore space just a couple of years ago. Now we're talking about LCOEs as low as 40 euros per megawatt hour. Some incredible opportunity that exists within the supply chain, within the development community, installation, logistics, you name it. The entire value chain is engaged in bringing power prices down for offshore wind. It's very exciting. And then also we start talking about what that impact has on that value chain. The supply chain players the consolidation in the sector. This is going to take big players. Big players are going to be commanding the attention of legislators around the world, folks that are going to be able to create jobs, that are going to be able to bring investment, that have the staying power to really go at this, for the long haul. And then, obviously the European Union has been the leader in this sector over the last few years, but there's a number of emerging markets that are popping up, and the United States is just one of them. We start talking about other areas such as Taiwan, even potentially India, China for that matter. Tremendous amount of opportunity around the globe that exists for offshore wind. Excellent. So where are we with respect to the global market? If we look at what we saw this past year, about 3.5 gigawatts put in, obviously most of it being within the European Union, some of it happening in China. Tremendous amount of growth still remains to be seen in the European Union, but also in China. The top blue, obviously still a small smidgen, but this is actually a good deal more than where we were just a few short years ago. When we talk about the United States and its positioning to support a viable offshore sector, I confess to being a pessimist of this a few years back, based upon where we are in terms of onshore and the incredible wealth of onshore wind resource that we do have here in this country. But as prices come down and the right players get involved, and the states really jump in and take control of their own future with respect to their energy resources, we've seen a great deal of growth, a great deal of potential in the United States. And when we start talking about the cost and how are we getting there, why is this getting attention? It's because of the pricing. If you look at the auction prices and how these have developed over the last few years, it's amazing. And as you can see there at the bottom, those 3 light blue diamonds, we start talking about Germany when we had the zero subsidy bids just a short while ago. So not only did we move from, in terms of lower cost of energy, moving down upwards of, 50-odd% in terms of where we were, and that had already shown some gains from where we were 10 years ago. There's a lot of reasons for that, and a lot of it has to do with technology. We look at megawatt ratings. Turbines are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. 3.6 megawatt Siemens turbine was ruled the land for years and years and years. And then more competition started to pop up. Turbines got bigger, moved to 5 megawatts, quickly moved to 6 megawatts, and then popped on to 8 megawatts. Now we're talking about 12 and 15 megawatt turbines that are likely to be installed in the mid-2020s. This is driving a great deal of the lower cost of energy that we see. It brings down the number of subsea structures you have to build. It reduces the amount of cabling, shortens the construction time, all for an equivalent megawatt level. That's terribly important. It also provides a great deal of opportunity for supply chain players, folks that are able to put the R&D dollars to work to actually be able to develop these very large machines and technologies that, we talked about 15 megawatt turbines, 5 years ago, we would have been laughing about it. And then accompanying that, the rotor diameters, 100+ meter blades, not rotor diameters, blades. I mean, think about that, well in excess of the length of a football field. One single blade. So moving those blades around, the heavy components, tons and tons of steel, tremendous amount of opportunity, and that has captured the interest of state legislators that want to be involved in this. And as I mentioned before, moving the stuff around. We've heard a lot, well, the folks that are aware here in the United States have been engaged in the U.S. Offshore industry, at least the early years of it. There's a great deal of interest in terms of logistics, specifically U.S. flagged vessels that have to be put in place because of the Jones Act. We'll talk a little bit about that during our panel discussion. But there's some opportunity when we start talking about the next generation of turbines. When we start to feel the lift, the real lift, in terms of installations here in the United States, you're going to be right in the sweet spot. Next generation of turbines is going to be coming online. The next generation of wind turbine installation vessels should be developed, should be deployed in the European Union, and hopefully be able to be brought to bear here in the United States. So a lot of interesting things happening. Specifically in the US, this is very much in flux. Why is it in flux? Well, I'd say, in our Q4 market outlook update, we were looking at the profile that you see up here. In the last 2 years there, 25, 26, we're 400 megawatts, not 800 megawatts. We didn't have real strong visibility on the New York pipeline at this point. We're still a little skeptical. And then the plan came out. We reviewed the plan, and our folks are reviewing and likely to do an upgrade in the Q1 market outlook update to reflect the new project timing, the very aggressive project timing to get all this done by 2030. On top of this, now this just happened about 2 hours ago, if you look at what happened in New Jersey, Governor Murphy has announced that they are reigniting their initiatives in the offshore space, looking to put 3.5 gigawatts in the water by 2030 and kicking it off with 1,100 megawatt tender. This is some very exciting stuff. So when you look at the size of the pipeline, the ability to gain some level of clarity with respect to this pipeline, the investment will come. It has happened in the UK, it has happened in Germany, and I'm absolutely positive it will happen here in the United States as well. So we're looking to capitalize on an opportunity, and we're going to look to talk a little bit more about this in detail. And with that, I'm going to close up my remarks and invite the panel onto the stage. So today, joining us from NYSERDA is going to be Doreen Harris. From Deepwater Wind will be Clint Plummer. And from Statoil will be Martin Goff. So with that, if the panelists can come on out. Make sure nothing's falling over. Great. Okay, first, thanks so much for joining us here tonight. A little bit of a chilly evening, but we've got a great crowd, and really excited to hear everyone's perspective about what we just laid out in terms of the future of the United States offshore wind industry. So with that, first and foremost, I'd like everyone to take a moment to introduce themselves, what they're doing at their respective company, and then specifically for the developers that we have with us, a little bit on the status of their projects that they have going on here in the United States.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to joining on this discussion. My name's Martin Goff, and I work for Statoil in our renewable and low carbon division. I'm responsible for developing our offshore wind assets with my current duties based around selecting suitable sites for development and then taking them through the permitting process. For those of you that don't know about Statoil, Statoil is a Norwegian global energy company. Its history is in oil and gas, but it's been moving towards a lower carbon future. And as part of that lower carbon strategy, we have two sort of arms to this. We have trying to increase our portfolio of renewables generation, so through traditional renewables projects such as wind, solar, those types, and also our other low carbon value chain. So trying to reduce our carbon footprint on existing and future oil and gas projects, looking at hydrogen value chain, and also developing carbon capture and storage. But being an offshore company, our bread and butter and our experiences in working in offshore environments, so that naturally leads us to being in offshore wind as our sort of key project area. And we've built up some experience in that over the years. By the end of this year, we should have about 1 gigawatt's worth of operating projects in Europe. We have a pipeline of permitted projects of 2.4 gigawatts to take forward. We have our floating wind farm, world's first commercial floating wind farm off of Scotland. And of course, we're developing a project here in the US. In terms of our other forays into the low carbon world, we have a $200 million venture fund to invest in low carbon technologies, which we're investing in companies in the US and the rest of the world. And we're looking to develop other sites throughout the world in the East Coast, the West Coast, and in emerging markets. So in terms of what I'm doing here today, you've probably noticed by my accent that I'm not a local, but I'm from London, but I've moved over here with my family to focus on developing and permitting the Empire Wind offshore wind project, which is just offshore of Long Island. We believe it has potential for over 1 gigawatt of deployed capacity, and we're working on understanding the site and seeing how we can develop that in the future. And all going well with the positive solicitations coming out from NYSERDA, we believe that we could have developable projects ready within the sort of 2023 onwards timeframe.
Great. Clint?
Thank you, and thanks for having us tonight. My name is Clint Plummer. I'm Vice President of Development with Deepwater Wind. We are a pure-play offshore wind development company. Company's about 10 years old. We started in 2007, focused on the premise that the area between Boston and Washington, D.C. needs new sources of power generation because the entire power generating system in this area was built in the post-World War II boom. The average power plant in this region is something in the range of 40 to 60 years old. So just think about the efficiency of a Ford F-150 pickup truck today versus a 1965 Ford F-150 pickup truck. That's a difference in the efficiencies of the power grid that we have today versus the technologies that we could use to deploy new types of energy generation. So starting with that premise, we started developing offshore wind because we believed that offshore wind could be not just the cleanest, but also the most cost-effective new source of power generation in that region between Boston and Washington, D.C. We're very proud that we have developed and are now operating the first offshore wind farm in the United States. It's a relatively small project called the Block Island Wind Farm that's located about 16 miles off the mainland of Rhode Island, about 3 miles off the coast of Block Island. It's 5 wind turbines. It makes about 30 megawatts of power, which will produce enough energy for 17,000 homes. And it was helpful in allowing that small community of Block Island to transition away from fossil-fired generation, where they were burning about 1 million gallons of diesel fuel every year, to completely shut down their existing diesel power plant and transition to 100% renewables from our wind farm. We see that as the first step, the demonstration project, and we're now moving forward with a larger portfolio of projects across the U.S. Northeast. We're also very excited and very honored to be developing the first offshore wind farm for New York State. It's called the South Fork Wind Farm, and much like Block Island, it was developed in response to a specific challenge. Long Island South Fork is an area that has the most rapid growth in energy consumption of any place in Long Island. And in 2015, the Long Island Power Authority ran a competitive solicitation looking for new sources of power generation. It was not a renewables-specific solicitation. It was open to all forms of power generation. LIPA got 21 different proposals from all forms of technologies. And after about a year-long evaluation, they concluded that our project, the South Fork Wind Farm, was the most cost-effective new source of power generation for that area. So that project is proving our thesis that offshore wind can not only deliver clean energy, but it can also be the most cost-effective new source of power generation. The company's involved in every market between Massachusetts and Maryland. In addition to our Block Island project, we also were awarded a contract to develop what will be the first offshore wind farm in the Mid-Atlantic region for the state of Maryland. That's a project that we call Skipjack, and we are also actively developing a project for the New England market called, appropriately, Revolution Wind. So we're very excited by the activity here in New York, and Doreen will talk about it right after me, I'm sure, but Governor Cuomo has made New York an absolute leader in the offshore wind industry by establishing a 2,400 megawatt goal, which is one of the largest, not just for any state, but of nations in the world. And so we are very excited to be one part of helping Governor Cuomo to meet that goal.
Great. Doreen?
Thank you, and thank you, Dan. I'm Doreen Harris. I'm the director of the Large Scale Renewables Program at NYSERDA. NYSERDA is appreciative of the opportunity to be here and really speak to New York's leadership in the offshore wind space. Specifically, Clint stole my thunder, but that's okay. You can come work for the state next, right? I do appreciate it because it is true. New York is really leading the way with regard to advancing offshore wind is a part of a broader suite of climate policy objectives. We have a really aggressive pursuit of renewable energy in the state. We have a clean energy standard, which is also nation leading. 50% of renewables by 2030 is really the beginning of it all from the perspective of advancing renewables for the state. As part of our advancement of the clean energy standard, Governor Cuomo did set a goal of 2,400 megawatts for the state. And that really sets the stage for, again, a very aggressive pursuit of offshore wind. As part of it, NYSERDA was tasked with the completion of an offshore wind master plan, which I'm pleased to say was released on Monday of this week. It was a over 2-year effort on the part of NYSERDA at the governor's direction to obtain really 2 objectives. That is, first, to responsibly develop offshore wind, and secondly, to cost effectively develop it for our state. So NYSERDA was tasked with the master plan, which really looked at offshore wind development in many regards, really from every angle, and I think tonight we'll have a chance to talk about some of those angles. But it's a very significant development for the state. This year, Governor Cuomo in his State of the State address announced 2 major developments in offshore wind. First, the commitment to procure offshore wind in an amount of at least 800 megawatts through 2 solicitations to be issued in 2018 and 2019. So this is very real manifestation of the goal, achievement of his goal. We started that process through the filing of a policy options paper with New York's Public Service Commission this week, concurrent with the release of the master plan. Also a really interesting topic for discussion tonight. In addition, the governor announced a $15 million investment in workforce and infrastructure development for the state. And a really important parallel path for the state is really to capture and be ready for what will be a completely new industry for the Northeast and the U.S. So many, many areas that we can cover tonight. I look forward to all of them, and we're glad you're in New York advancing offshore wind with us, so thanks.
Thanks, Doreen. Great. So thanks so much for everyone for lending your thoughts. And let's, just as a quick reminder, we're going to have some questions, some Q&A, obviously, amongst the panel, and we invite the folks here in the audience to contribute their questions as well with the index cards. They'll be brought up to me, and we'll try to tackle those at the end of the session. So first and foremost, Doreen, I wanted to build upon a little bit of what you just mentioned in terms of the 2.4 gigawatts by 2030, that being the goal set by Governor Cuomo. Why such an aggressive campaign? If you look at where most states have wound up in the last couple of years, 20%, 25%, California being obviously looked at as the leader in many respects for the nation, why did New York take such an aggressive stance in terms of its clean energy policy?
Well, New York's clean energy policy is predicated really at the beginning of a planning process from the state, which is our state energy plan, which really set the stage for the policies that are now advancing. New York is serious in its fight against climate change, as I indicated, and renewables are a critical part of that achievement. With regard to really thinking about the achievement of the goal, there's many renewables that can contribute. We have really set the stage through some really targeted advancement of primarily land-based renewables. We have the largest procurements ever issued by a state that were issued jointly by NYSERDA and NYPA earlier this year. And really the corollary to that is the resource that creates really tremendous value for New York State, and that is offshore wind. You couldn't imagine a more perfect resource really to serve New York given the resource's proximity to our load centers. The resource is also optimally its profile of generation is optimal from the perspective of when offshore wind generates and when we need generation in our state. And really, we understand that there are benefits that come to the state from a consistent and significant policy objective of offshore wind. I mentioned one of our goals was cost-effective offshore wind development. And one of the ways we intend to achieve that is by setting these objectives that are, again, consistent, long-term, and certain. And that with that commitment, we believe that New York stands to really become a hub for the commensurate industry that will come. We know that New York is optimally situated for offshore wind development, but we're also optimally situated to support the industry that will come with offshore wind. And many of the work, much of the work that we worked toward with the publication of the master plan was intended to achieve that result. New York knows we're in a race with other states, but it's a race we think we can win. And we believe we can win this by setting these policies and sticking to them.
Great, thanks. And along the same lines, the carve-out itself, 2.4 gigawatts. If you look at the development community, obviously it's, to the layman, a fairly substantial amount of power. When we start talking about making large-scale investments, sometimes folks are looking for even more. So I'd look to the developers, Clint and Martin, when we start talking about 2.4 gigawatts. Is it enough? We talk about Empire Wind itself possibly putting out over 1,000 megawatts. Is the 2.4 enough? Do we have to look at this more regionally? And is there more to be gained? So if we have successful demonstration products as we had in Block Island, and we look at what's happening now, I mean, is this just the first phase? Are we setting ourselves up for even more upside long term? And Clint, you can go to.
Yeah, I mean, we think of the 2.4 gigawatts as a necessary stepping stone to be able to make offshore wind a competitive resource on the open market. So Governor Cuomo's established the goal of transitioning the state to 50% renewables as a floor. That doesn't mean that that's the maximum. The same thing applies with offshore wind at 2.4 gigawatts. We see offshore wind as being on a very clear path, coming down very consistently, very predictably in cost, in much the same way that we've seen other technologies like solar. So by having that clarity of demand, knowing that over the next several years that the state will be providing opportunities for us to sell power at predictable prices, that gives us the ability to plan a supply chain with our vendors, with vessel providers, with port facilities that will make offshore wind considerably more cost effective in the future. In that respect, we see a pathway to offshore wind being competitive, not just with any other renewable resource across the state, but with all resources across the state. So this is a pathway for making this resource available broadly.
Mm-hmm. Martin?
Yeah, and in terms of the aggressive approach and targets for this, I think we very much welcome this. This is a target to 2030, and this type of certainty through a pipeline of projects, 2.4 gigawatts is quite a number of projects to develop, and also the certainty of there being offtake options coming as well. It's that type of certainty and that type of pipeline that gives us as developers the confidence to invest in these lease areas, and also the supply chain to invest. And I think as Clint touched on there, this is just the start of it, 2.4 gigawatts. Once we start to show that these things can be built, they can be built in a cost-effective manner, safely and responsibly, then I think the more projects and more leasing areas will definitely follow.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point. I mean, the headline for this panel is offshore wind as part of a greener grid. Well, our grid is growing in its demand for power at the same time as old power plants are going away. Mm-hmm. So you think about the number of devices that we have in our homes that are increasing power consumption, and at the same time, you look at trends in transportation. 50 years ago, we lived in a world in which Detroit built big, heavy cars, and Texas provided the fuels for them. Now we're living in a world where we have a very clear path to seeing transportation becoming electrified, both with automobiles like Tesla and with increasing use of public transportation. That's going to mean more need for electricity. So yes, 2.4 gigawatts is a good and necessary start. And with that stepping stone, we can create a cost-effective source of supplying our increasing need for electric power.
And from that 2.4 gigawatts from New York State, we've seen the states themselves obviously take the lead. Taking a step back for a moment, looking at the federal picture and the Trump administration and the role they may play with respect to renewable energy here in the near term, there was a tremendous amount of concern when the Trump administration came into power in regards to its potential negative impact on the renewable space. We've actually seen a continuing uptick or a continued rise of the acceptance of renewables instead in some of the policies that are being proposed, taking an all-of-the-above approach and actually helping offshore wind in certain circumstances as well as onshore, despite some of the more recent activities associated with the Section 201 solar towers. But when we're talking about the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, the federal government, what role do they have to play moving forward? Do we expect any policy developments at the federal level? And if not, what do we have to do? Do we start looking at more regional approaches, or do we continue forward on the state level?
Yeah, the unique thing about offshore wind, unlike offshore oil and gas, is most of the control is in the hands of the state. I think one of the things that the Cuomo administration and the governor himself have realized, much to their credit, is that this is driven by state policy, which means that the state has the ability to drive the development of offshore wind. The role of the federal government is twofold. One, they are our landlord. And if this administration knows much about anything, it's about being a landlord. The second thing that they have a role in is being a permitting authority. Our Block Island wind farm required over 20 different federal, state, and local permits. About half of those came from various federal agencies coordinated through BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management that you made reference to. The Trump administration has been working to expedite permitting. Now, from our perspective, we believe that these projects need to be done with the highest level of environmental scrutiny and with the highest level of respect for the existing uses in those spaces. So we spend a lot of time on science, but from our perspective, the primary role of advancing offshore wind falls to the states, and New York has done an excellent job of creating a policy framework to be able to move that forward.
Doreen?
Yeah, thank you. We have been very encouraged by the all-of-the-above strategy that we've seen from the federal government. It certainly comports with other aspects of their advancement of infrastructure initiatives, for instance, because as Clint will tell you and Martin will tell you, that's what we're talking about here. These are major infrastructure projects, and in fact, when one looks at aspects of offshore wind construction, it's really not all that different than a major highway or bridge or other major developments that we've certainly hear the president and others speak of as priorities. So the all-of-the-above strategy has manifested itself, in our view, in a very positive working relationship with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, a very focused interest on the efficiency of the process. We, as a state, have another interest with BOEM beyond the efficiency of the processes as Clint just described them, and that is this year, actually in October of 2017, NYSERDA and New York State took the work that we had completed as part of our master plan and put that together and analyzed the ocean space that we can rely on for offshore wind development, ultimately identifying an area for BOEM to consider for future leasing for offshore wind development. And this is a major development from the state and really the product of an unprecedented amount of work that had been undertaken. As much as we agree that there is a interesting and really full supply of offshore wind with the existing areas for the near term, we as a state have long-term objectives that will ultimately require additional areas to be leased beyond those that are currently accessible to New York. The area that we identified is really now in the hands of BOEM to advance through their process. They have indicated that they will soon be issuing a call for information and nominations, which starts their leasing process. And really, our work with BOEM has been very positive in really with regard to both advancing leasing, but further doing so in a way that is mindful of the work that New York has completed, and also mindful of the timeframes in which we would like to have those areas ultimately identified and leased.
Right. And Doreen, you had made mention with respect to an arms race of sorts amongst the North Atlantic states. And we very much see the same thing. When we start talking about the initial volley being fired by Massachusetts with the 1.6 gigawatts, followed up by 2.4 gigawatts, and now 3.5 gigawatts with New Jersey, we see this rapid proliferation of new state incentive mechanism, everyone seemingly trying to one-up one another. So firstly, with respect to the developers, and Martin, if you want to leave this off, is it imperative to be playing in all of these states, or is a more focused approach, a project-by-project approach, most important? How do you look at this regionally versus just a singular project level? Which is more important? Do you feel like the operational scale is absolutely imperative and need to engage on a regional basis?
I think for Statoil, we want to grow our portfolio of offshore wind projects, and we see the east coast of the US as being one of our target areas for that. We think there's fantastic potential here, and so we're open to looking at all of the states, not just here in New York, to develop that portfolio. We have long-term ambitions to grow. And I think competition amongst the different states is healthy. I think competition amongst suppliers for us developers to choose is good. I think competition in the auctions amongst developers going for the lowest bid is good, and between the states is good. We need that competition for this industry to grow. So I welcome it, and we'll be looking for the best sites, the most developable sites, and where we can sort of build these.
Clint?
I'm not sure I agree with your premise. I'm not sure that there's an arms race at all. I think that the governors of New York and Massachusetts and New Jersey have recognized that there's a fundamental need, and that by being in a leadership position, there are advantages to those states. As we think about it, we know that decisions are going to need to be made about what type of energy supply system we have. Something is going to need to be built at a very large scale to supply power for the increasing demand and to replace retiring power plants in the Boston to Washington corridor. We believe fundamentally that offshore wind is the most cost-effective way of supplying that need for new sources of power. It also has the benefit of being clean and creating a lot of jobs. But there's also a false narrative that says that these states are going to compete and wrestle over a finite number of jobs. The U.S. Department of Energy has said that the offshore wind programs that are in place today are expected to result in about 40,000 jobs in the area between Boston and Washington, D.C. by 2030. That is a massive number of jobs. That's almost the equivalent of Amazon's HQ2. It's a large industry. It's a $20 billion global industry today that's only going to continue to grow. Our biggest challenge in putting up 5 wind turbines off the coast of Rhode Island was getting enough port space. We had to use 4 different facilities across the state of Rhode Island just to put up 5 wind turbines. Martin's project is going to take a couple of hundred turbines. Our projects, when fully built out, will take several hundred turbines. There is a massive investment in infrastructure and supply chain that's going to need to be built out, and no one state is going to do all of that. Governor Cuomo has positioned New York State very well with the investments that he's made and the leadership that he's taken. But it's a false narrative to say that it's going to be controlled by one state. This is a big regional industry that's going to deliver a lot of benefits in the form of cleaner air, lower cost power, and good jobs across the region.
And along those lines, when we start talking about the scale of the investment, agreed, absolutely enormous. We're talking billions of dollars at stake here. Obviously, those projects are substantial, and the financial needs of those projects are substantial. When we start talking about what we have today in terms of our targets, it does provide that strong foundation. What is necessary to really continue and build momentum in terms of more folks such as Statoil, such as Deepwater, becoming more and more comfortable, as well as their financiers? What do we need in terms of incentive mechanisms, and what do we see out there in the space today? And actually, Doreen, I'd like you to lead that off.
Sure. Yeah, we're starting a process in New York State to consider just that. And I had referenced earlier a filing that NYSERDA had made to the Public Service Commission in New York on Monday. This will start a regulatory process through which just that question is deliberated really in the public and ultimately ordered by the Public Service Commission. And that is, what policy should New York adopt to at least begin the procurements that will be necessary toward our 2.4 gigawatt goal. The paper that NYSERDA filed is really looking at 7 different options that the state could utilize for the first phase of those procurements, the 800 megawatts this year and next. This is a complicated topic, and it's somewhat more complicated by the structures that are in place within New York. What NYSERDA looked at was both the options from the perspective of their feasibility, their compatibility with wholesale markets, their ability, most importantly, to bring down costs. Costs can be reduced in many ways by the volume that is being procured, but also the certainty of the mechanism that is utilized, therefore allowing folks like Martin and Clint to get the best deal for New York's ratepayers that they possibly can. Ultimately, really what we looked at is that there is a trajectory for offshore wind to really be at parity with other renewables that the state is procuring. And that's really our objective as a state, is to create the preconditions necessary to bring that to light. So as a resource, offshore wind and procurement is a really important part for the state because it makes it real. It means that we as a state are moving forward in this predictable manner, and the actual path and the process to achieve it is one in which we'll be unfolding really this year in New York State through that process.
Okay. Gentlemen, Clint, Martin?
Yeah, I think we've been exposed to a lot of these different procurement mechanisms throughout Europe, and each one has its pros and cons. So it really comes down to the details of those. And we welcome the release of the policy paper on this, and we look forward to digesting that and working through it in the coming days. But it's all about the content of it, the size of it. We sort of believe in Statoil that a larger procurement gets better value through maximising the cost benefits. But we also really need to see that predictability, the longer term predictability of these procurement mechanisms. Offshore wind has sort of modest returns, but it's those predictable modest returns that are what are attractive. It's understanding that risk that allows us to invest sometimes $3 to $4 billion in one of these projects to know that we're going to get that back. And these are attractive investments. We've seen pension funds buy into these types of projects in Europe. So having that predictability is key to this, I think.
Martin hit on a really excellent point, which is what he said about these projects having modest returns. The offshore wind business model is really very simple. It's identical to any type of renewable energy power generation. In renewable energy, the benefit is that we don't have fuel costs. Our entire cost is based on putting a big investment into the ground, or in our case, into the water, and then harvesting the energy that we can capture from that technology to, over time, pay back the amount of capital that we have to deploy to build it. So by having a predictable source of revenue, by having a predictable price at which we know that we can sell that energy, then the only risk that we take is the production that comes off of that wind farm. And in that case, we can manage that. That's our risk. That's appropriate. We're like farmers. We put something in the ground. As long as we know that we are responsible for getting that up and out of the ground and being able to take it to market, then that's in our control. If we have a predictable price at market, that then allows us to go out to the financial markets and attract the lowest cost capital available. That's how we beat fossil fuels. Fossil fuels cannot tell you what the price for their energy will be in 5 or 10 years. I can tell you with 100% certainty what the power from the Block Island wind farm or the South Fork wind farm or the Skipjack wind farm will cost in 20 years from now without any doubt whatsoever. And we can do that by having this type of certainty. Now, New York is in an especially good position for doing this sort of thing because for the last 15 years, Doreen's organization, NYSERDA, has been managing procurements of large-scale renewables and small-scale renewables in onshore wind and solar farms. And so because of that unique combination of the large resource we have here in New York and the organizational infrastructure with groups like NYSERDA, New York can very quickly move into creating a big market for this.
And one of the other things that you had mentioned previously, when we start talking about the competitiveness of offshore wind, Doreen mentioned the fact that it has very good proximity to the load centers on the East Coast of the United States. And along the same lines, it has become a mature technology. But we still have a good long way to go when we start talking about cost reduction. If we look at the slides that are presented earlier, we talk about the LCOE, a lot of that is predicated on advancements that are in the order of 5 to 7 years ahead in terms of build schedule. We're facing a near-term threat now in the onshore space. If you look at onshore wind versus PV in terms of solar power here in the United States, areas that have good solar resource versus areas that have good areas of wind resource. How do you see solar fitting into this mix? Offshore wind and solar, and also storage as well. Storage prices also plummeting. Deepwater Wind has been engaged in some activities associated with offshore plus storage. So Doreen,
So is Statoil.
yeah, and so is Statoil. That's right, correct. So along those same lines, Doreen, do you have a couple of comments in terms of how NYSERDA looked at this in terms of playing smaller solar power type installations versus much larger scale offshore installations? And then what do we see as the two? Are the good competitors? Is this something that is good for the industry in terms of one driving the other? Or does one win out over the other in the end?
That's a great question. So the way the Clean Energy Standard was designed at the beginning, when it was adopted in 2016 by our Public Service Commission, it didn't have specific carve-outs by technology. It looked specific. It looked at price, and price is really the driver with regard to how my team selects projects through the solicitations that we issue. It's really, really exciting times for land-based renewables in New York State. It's plain and simple. We see a really, really strong market for utility scale solar coming to the forefront. We see more projects of that magnitude coming into the state in the interconnection queues and the siting processes that we have. But we also see technology improvements driving land-based wind prices down to quite unprecedented levels as well. New York has a modest wind resource for land-based renewables, yet we're seeing projects really use those technology advances to drive prices to very, very competitive levels. That said, offshore wind is part of the mix in New York State right now. Much like the federal government, New York has an all-of-the-above strategy for renewables generally. We recognize, though, that offshore wind in the very near term would not compete with other land-based renewables, but we see a very clear path, as I said, to the point where it will. And that's really what we're seeking to move forward through this first phase of procurements for offshore wind for the state. So we see all of these resources having unique values to the state. And really, for the first time, New York, NYSERDA, in its procurement this year, actually provided incentives for developers to pair storage with renewables and saw really interesting results, really creative results, as I'm sure my colleagues can offer in a second. So again, all of this works together toward the achievement of our Clean Energy Standard goal, and ultimately the goals are big enough for all of them to fit.
Clint?
Yeah, so I agree with Doreen that technology has advanced very considerably in recent years and has made onshore resources like wind and solar a lot more cost effective. But I think it's a false dichotomy to compare onshore resources and offshore wind because they are fundamentally different products. There is not enough physical space to build onshore wind or solar in any meaningful quantities whatsoever near the major load centers, let me rephrase that, near where people live. So I'll give you an example. Our South Fork wind farm is going to be the first offshore wind farm in New York State. It's about 90 megawatts in size, which is very modest in the scale of offshore wind. It'll produce enough power for about 50,000 homes. That's a fraction of the size of Martin's project or even some of the other projects that we're developing. But that project, if you were going to try to develop enough land-based solar to produce the equivalent amount of energy of even that very small offshore wind farm, you would need to pave over 1,500 acres of land with solar panels. Nothing else on that land, not on rooftops, pave over the land. And that's just for a very small offshore wind farm, 50,000 homes. Now think about that in the context of New York City. Where do we find 1,500 acres? Where do we find 15,000 acres of land? The point is, you're not going to find that amount of land to be able to develop a comparable resource, which is why offshore wind makes so much sense in densely populated coastal areas, which basically is the Boston to Washington corridor. Now, you brought up a great question earlier about energy storage. Energy storage, much like other renewable energy technologies, is advancing at a very rapid pace. And we see a world that is not that far away in which we stop thinking about renewable energy projects as environmental policy driven, nice to have nuisances to the grid that help to lower emissions. We see a world that is not too far away in which developers like my company and like Martin's are developing and delivering fully integrated renewable and storage projects that have all the characteristics of conventional power plants from a reliability perspective. That world is within our reach, and within the coming years, you will see these projects being developed as a means of fully transitioning us to a baseload renewables world in which renewables are the standard and fossil is the exception. Mm-hmm. And that'll be cheaper than what we have today, too.
Yep. Martin?
Yeah, I think we're as surprised as everyone with the rapid cost reduction and increasing capacity of solar. But we've also seen those rapid decreases in offshore wind as well. We can see those coming here in the US. We've seen it in Europe, and very recently we've benefited from that cost reduction. We submitted a zero bid into a Dutch auction. Mm-hmm. It's not directly comparable to here, but we can see where things can go. We don't necessarily see solar as being in competition with us, but we can complement each other. I think we need different generators in the energy mix here. And I think both Doreen and Clint hit the point. It's about being by the load center, being able to plug in a gigawatt, 2 gigawatts into New York where that power is needed. That's where offshore wind really has those benefits.
Okay, great. Now, fantastic discussion. We got like 25 more questions, but I can just see where we're at on time. So I want to get into some of the nitty-gritty in terms of the project development activities. When we're talking about offshore wind, one of the things that sticks in people's mind is the significant challenges that offshore wind faced just 5 odd years ago in terms of permitting challenges and a lack of state activity associated with legislation that's going to support offshore wind. We've seen a lot of good changes in that fashion. But in terms of the good old-fashioned project development activities, what challenges do you folks see that are still present today? What are the biggest challenges you have in terms of getting these projects in the water now that we've gotten past some of the state legislation and incentive mechanisms that were holding back some of that demand? What's next for you guys at the project level? Martin, you want to start?
I think one of the key challenges for this, I think it's Clint very rightly said, these projects need to be developed in a robust and responsible manner. We need to make sure we get this right, and we get them, with minimal harm to the environment, safe projects. And one of the key challenges to that, one of the long lead items, is collecting your environmental data. That can take several years to get baseline environmental data or technical data. We've actually seen that through work by NYSERDA with the master plan, some of the offshore surveys, some of BOEM's environmental surveys, and the New York DEC. We've been able to use that data use that in our project development and probably take a year or two off of what would have been the previous sort of permitting schedule. So there are challenges out there, but we've seen some really great steps to reduce those challenges. And we've also seen moves from BOEM to try and reduce the burden on the developer and try and improve things through implementing the design envelope, which will give us as developers flexibility going forward, because trying to determine exactly what we're going to build in 5 to 7 years' time can be a challenge, especially with the fast-moving technology out there. So there are challenges, but in this particular state and this particular time, I think those challenges are being listened to and are being met, and it's quite positive.
Okay, great. Clint?
I'd break it down to kind of three things: making good decisions, building trust in communities, and having the infrastructure to be able to develop the industry. So as we think about it, to develop a good offshore wind project, you need an incredible amount of data. You need to gather data on the offshore environment. You need to gather data on what exists on the seafloor and hundreds of feet beneath it. You need to gather information about long-term climatic trends on how the wind turbines will perform. So the first challenge is ensuring that you start with the right data sets and that you're bringing the right team around you to evaluate all of the relevant factors from technical and environmental perspectives, because we have to go through a very robust, appropriately so, environmental review process. For Block Island, that involved over 20 different federal, state, and local permits and approvals, and we anticipate that all of our future projects will have that same level of scrutiny and review. So we not only have to satisfy ourselves that we've made a good decision in the design of the project, but we also have to satisfy a very large number of external reviewers. One anecdote on this is that in the case of our Block Island wind farm, our federal regulator required that our foundations be designed to withstand the 1,000-year storm. In case you're interested, that's a 60-foot tall rogue wave hitting the foundation. So I'm very pleased to report that if there's a 60-foot rogue wave 3 miles off the coast of Rhode Island, our wind farm will survive through that. There might be other bigger problems if we have a 60-foot rogue wave, but nonetheless, the foundations will survive that. So making good decisions is one part of it. The second is building trust in communities. And there's been a lot of talk in the past about the Cape Wind project and some of the problems that had. It fought a 15-year losing battle, and just a few months ago finally acknowledged that it was not going to be moving forward. And the biggest problem that Cape Wind faced was that they didn't build trust in their local communities. They did a lot of science, and some of that was, in fact, very good cutting-edge science, but they didn't engage appropriately with the community, and that's fundamentally the difference between Cape Wind and Block Island, is that we took a very high-touch, very costly, very time-intensive approach of working very closely with the local community to listen, to understand what was important, and then respond to it. And then the final challenge is about making sure you've got the right infrastructure. And, Doreen and others in her organization are working on that for New York State, but as I mentioned earlier, that's one of the biggest challenges we faced with Block Island. America, in the Northeast at least, does not have the same type of industrial waterfront capacity that we did 50 or 100 years ago. We don't have the same type of industrial waterfront capacity that places in Europe have today. And so as we think about developing projects, we also have to think about developing the supply chain that goes along to support those.
Before we get to the supply chain piece, Doreen, you did an enormous amount of outreach associated with building up this master plan. When we start talking about that outreach, what has been your experience here in New York State specifically in terms of these different stakeholder groups? Has the tide shifted? Are we seeing a greater level of acceptance, especially now that we do have some steel in the water when we start talking about Block Island? What is it that you see out there today, and who are the key collaborators that could really help push this movement and help increase the pace of project development here in the Northeast region?
Thanks. I'm glad you asked. We did undertake an unprecedented amount of stakeholder outreach as part of the development of the Offshore Wind Master Plan. in addition to 20 different studies and surveys that ran the gamut from a full assessment of 65 different port facilities that have different qualities that could serve the offshore wind industry. We also conducted a complete workforce opportunity study, which looked at not only the job creation opportunities, the headline has been 5,000 jobs, $6 billion industry, but also the capabilities that New York can offer that burgeoning industry. In addition, we work and continue to work to address just those challenges that Clint and Martin described with regard to the availability of information. We have undertaken studies and surveys to characterize the area in ways that ultimately will provide project developers with a site that has less risk associated with it, because they will understand the site from the perspective of the wind resource, the environmental conditions, the seabed conditions, and others that will ultimately help them sharpen their pencils when it comes time to bid a project to New York State. And we intend to continue that in the coming years. Our master plan speaks to various initiatives we'll be undertaking this year, both with regard to outreach to stakeholders, but also additional studies that we will be undertaking, including a campaign to measure wave and weather and wind conditions in the ocean space near New York. All of this adds up to a really comprehensive piece of work by New York State that is ongoing to advance offshore wind responsibly. That said, through our travels along Long Island and New York City, which is ongoing, we have, I would say, a very informed populace, very interested in energy issues, very aware of energy issues, and very concerned about climate change impacts. So if I could summarize the views that I have learned through my interactions personally with my fellow residents of New York State, I would say that we have a very supportive population who's very interested in advancing offshore wind, as I said, responsibly. They're informed enough to know that there are challenges to be met, there's balances to be struck, and ultimately our work with the stakeholders and with our technical analyses really helped us to identify the areas that we feel are best suited for offshore wind development for the state.
Okay. And when we're talking about some of the state level initiatives and overcoming NIMBYism at the stakeholder level, I mean, nothing speaks more loudly than the promise of new jobs. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, as Clint referred to, revitalization of industrial waterfront type properties and so on and so forth. When we look at some of the activities that are ongoing just even now, if you look at what's happened in New Bedford in terms of the terminal out there that's going to support much of the build that's going to happen in Massachusetts, some of the recent announcements in Maryland in terms of activity there to support the operations and maintenance long-term of these projects at its ports, and then the Trade Point Atlantic activity. Just the list goes on and on already, and we haven't even begun to really see substantial volume. What are the challenges that lie ahead? What do we need? What's left? What do we actually have to see in terms of port infrastructure development to actually support what we see as over 3 gigawatts of installations within the next 10 years? What has to happen? And Martin, if you'd like to lead that off, please.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, we welcome the Ports and Harbours report that NYSERDA compiled as part of the master plan. We think that's going to be really useful information to inform what's out there, what needs to be developed, and what needs to be improved. It's a bit of a difficult one to know. I think one of the things is space. Obviously, these are the mega projects. They need a lot of space, a lot of capacity for the construction side of things. And we recognise that some of those will need investment. And again, we welcome the investment opportunities that the state's looking at for those. We have seen in Europe that it also comes down to the ports and harbours themselves being part of that development process, and the first movers, the places like Esbjerg in Denmark that took those steps to redevelop their facilities for offshore wind, are the ones that are getting the work going forward. So but we'd be very welcome to work with the different ports and harbour facilities to so they understand what we're looking for in terms of development, and the timescale, so that those facilities can meet our requirements and the future growth of offshore wind.
Great. Clint?
I think a lot of what's necessary has already been put into motion. I think the big difference between Europe and the U.S. is that, no surprise, much of Europe had a centrally planned approach to developing offshore wind. The U.S. is more markets driven. And so in this respect, the fact that Governor Cuomo, Governor Baker, Governor Hogan in Maryland, and now Governor Murphy in New Jersey have all put out very strong and clear indications of their intent to create both near-term procurements and long-term pipelines of demand, creates exactly the right market-based environment for market participants like my company and Statoil and other competitors to move into that market, to offer our very best products forward, to compete, to reduce prices, and then to partner with our supply chains to be able to competitively build out a regional industry that is capable of delivering these projects and creating long-term jobs. So I think that the mechanisms that are necessary are in place, and now the responsibility falls to the developers who win contracts that come out of these procurements to actually deliver on the things that we've committed to. If we do that and we do what we've promised to do, then there will be a big, vibrant, and long-lasting offshore wind industry in the U.S. Northeast.
Great. I'm going to go a little bit off of our, running, like I said, running short a little bit on time here, but there's some great questions from the audience that I'd like to tackle. So first and foremost, we have a couple with respect to utility ownership within the marketplace. If you look at what has happened in the onshore market to date, you have seen limited utility ownership. A lot of the work has been done by independent power producers across the United States. We do expect that there'll be increased levels of utility engagement in the onshore sector. What about offshore? Is there a time, is this something that needs to mature more before utilities become comfortable in having a direct ownership role within offshore wind? Martin?
We've seen wind developer companies partnering with utilities, and it's an interesting model, and one that we're open to exploring as well. It's still early days for us to try and understand the market here and how we could work with utilities in that. So it is an interesting model that we will sort of at least look at in the future. It's probably something for more of the more advanced, mature projects to respond to at this particular stage, though.
Great.
I think there are two things to consider there. One is market power and the extent to which any utility could manipulate a market if they were in control of a project. That's the reason why much of the Northeast has gone through deregulation to separate utility transmission and distribution from power generation. And then I think about cost effectiveness. What makes the most sense for the ratepayers across the state that are going to be paying for it? We think that there's a right way and a wrong way for utilities to participate in the industry. And there's many different ways that could be structured, but anything that would be done from a oversight perspective should ensure that there's not market power or potential for manipulation. So for example, in the case of our Revolution Wind project serving New England, we've developed a partnership with National Grid, which is one of the largest utilities in New England. But we've been very careful in how we've structured that, so that National Grid, at the completion of the development of our project, when it starts operating, will own all of the offshore transmission infrastructure and will be able to build that out over time as additional developers in the region build offshore wind projects. In that sense, we've kept the separation between generation and transmission so that we as an independent power producer continue to operate in the free market, and they as a transmission operator operate in their market. That's one model, but we think it's a good one. Second, we think about cost effectiveness. In many markets, utility affiliates will buy generation assets, some renewable, some conventional. In that case, they often make the case that their cost of capital is lower. We believe that with modern project finance, that we can achieve a lower cost of capital, but at the end of the day, it should really come down to who has the most cost-effective capital to be able to build out these projects. In that respect, it should be in the best interest of ratepayers.
Right. And along those lines, with talking about the utility engagement, although they might not have a direct ownership role, they are going to have a part to play. And one of the things that we did see early on, we talked about the Cape Wind days, was the inability for them to hold on to a power purchase agreement. And in that case, it was one of the main reasons that project inevitably came to failure. And the importance of that, the business certainty associated with the power purchase agreement or whatever, when we start talking about ORECs or index RECs and so on and so forth. I don't want to get into the details of each one of those individual mechanisms, but there are a couple of questions, and they do discuss the criticality of feed-in tariffs in getting the European offshore sector off the ground. Do we have a similar situation here? We saw the ORECs happening in Maryland, but the utilities are being legislated to buy these offshore power via carve-outs. How critical is something along the lines of a feed-in tariff? How critical is offtake when we start talking about the ability to finance these projects?
Well, first of all, Cape Wind didn't die as a result of any error on the part of the utilities. I'm not a utility apologist, but I am an apologist for the truth. And the case is that Cape Wind died because they were unable to build enough trust in their communities to get past years of litigation. So their power purchase agreements had expirations in them that they had to either be able to get past the litigation, build the project, or they expired. That's just a simple business term, and they failed at that. That was the fault of the developer, not the utilities. So with that in mind, I will speak out of the other side of my mouth and say that offtake in whatever form is absolutely critical for offshore wind, because our business model is one of putting a lot of capital into the ground and then very patiently working to cultivate energy and sell that energy. It's our risk to make the energy, but we depend on having a predictable customer to buy that power from us at a predictable price. If we know that we've got a customer and we know that we can sell the power at a set price, then we can bring very cost-effective capital to be able to recover our very significant investment. That's all we need.
Doreen, anything to add?
Sure. I will say that among the 7 options that we presented to the Commission this week, among those options included all of the options that you just described, essentially. No feed-in tariff, but utility ownership is one of the options we considered. In New York, there's very limited circumstances today where a utility would own generation. However, with the real goal of presenting the Commission with the suite of options to which they could avail themselves for cost-effective procurement of renewables, we did include really every option that we could envision that would really allow a fulsome explanation and exploration of what is a really unique asset for the state, as we've discussed. Specific to Clint's point, transmission is a unique aspect of offshore wind. We presented it as such in the paper and really presented a few options for transmission alone for the Commission to consider. That said, not every state does have a NYSERDA in the mix. NYSERDA operates uniquely in the state from the perspective of procurements. So in a way, we're operating a bit like a utility in the contracts that we execute today. And indeed, there are dates when projects need to be online in our contracts, and that is a requirement for good reason, because we need the generation when it's committed as a state. However, within the world of options, there are various flavors of contracting that really will become the subject of this public comment period that will be coming up this year, that run the gamut from utility PPAs to utility ownership to various ways that NYSERDA could operate in this market, various forms of certainty that we could provide through various contracting structures. All of this is compared, though, on a cost basis, because it is absolutely true that different structures will yield different premiums to our ratepayers, and that is a very important part of how we need to think about advancing this policy. So the discussion really isn't just about the various flavors of procurement and contracting, but also the related impacts and really the feasibility of achieving those goals as the governor has set forth to be issued in 2018.
Right. And you made an interesting point there, and pertinent to the question that was posed. When we talk about the role of feed-in tariffs and where are they now, they are going away. And there is a reason for that. There is substantial costs that were incurred in the European Union with respect to those feed-in tariffs. And the fact of the matter is, through competitive bidding, we've come to see just how low the cost of renewables can be. So it's really pulled back the veil and shown that those feed-in tariffs are no longer needed. So I think that's a terribly important
It's
element.
true. And indeed, beyond all else, with any option that we have really identified for commission consideration, all are predicated on the presumption of competition.
Absolutely.
And really, that's been a tenet that New York has held for many years for our prior policy, the Renewable Portfolio Standard, and indeed under the Clean Energy Standard as well. We see through that competition a really robust opportunity for both many developers to be involved in the state, but also the reality that we've set the goals, we've set the measures, and it's up to them to compete for the contract.
And if I can just weigh in on that,
Yeah.
we think that's the right approach.
Right.
We think that over the long term, feed-in tariffs and all these forms of support structures should go away. Our goal is to create a highly competitive market for new resources, new power resources. We want to see a world in the future in which we as offshore wind developers are competing head-to-head with new conventional power plant developers, and when utilities need new sources of power, they run the same type of open solicitation that LIPA ran on the South Fork and say, hey, we need power, who can provide it to us? And we go in and we compete on a cost basis without any type of external support, and we'll win in those types of situations. What we need to get to that point is to build out our local supply chains, to be able to train up local workforces that can build this industry. It's been done in Europe. It took Europe 25 years to do it. We can do it a lot faster here. And with the types of policies that Governor Cuomo has put in place here, that Governor Baker's put in place in Massachusetts, Governor Murphy in New Jersey, and Governor Hogan in Maryland, with those types of policies, there's a very clear path for us having enough support to be able to build up our industries and to be able to create a very large supply chain that we see creating that platform to be able to create a cost-effective new source of supply.
Right. And then another separate topic was brought up in terms of, obviously there's a great deal of focus on New York State and the Northeast region, that's where we are, but in terms of where else do we see opportunity that may exist for offshore wind in the United States? There's a note that was made that we didn't see a lot in terms of makes projections on the west coast of the U.S., nor do we see a tremendous amount in the Great Lakes. There is a demonstrator project that is going to go forward, the Icebreaker project in the Great Lakes. And there's unique attributes associated with the Great Lakes, obviously fresh water, freezing, the issues associated with ice, and the ability of foundation subsea structures to deal with ice load in the Great Lakes. That's why that Icebreaker project is going to be so unique and so interesting. West Coast, it's more about depth, and we start talking about water depth. And I'd like to kick that over to Martin. You are you are at the leading edge in terms of floating wind in the European Union. When we talk about West Coast wind, offshore wind, I should say, the discussion inevitably moves towards floating offshore wind foundations. Where are we right now? What's the opportunity for floating wind?
We are very active in the West Coast, particularly in California, where we believe that there is definitely a market for floating wind. Before taking on this role, I spent a year as looking for sites out in California for our floating high wind concept. We believe that there is enough capacity out there for to build up a supply chain. At the moment, there are issues with finding the sites. Hopefully, we can resolve those working with BOA and with some of the state authorities and interested stakeholders, but we certainly believe there to be opportunities for floating on the West Coast and Hawaii as well.
Great. Last question. So we're running out of time. We're out of time right now. And just to conclude with respect to the state of the industry, where do we expect it to go? I put forth a slide earlier that looked at about 3 gigawatts in the United States, largely predicated on demand that's been discussed at a state level here in the Northeast region, but through the 2026 timeframe, plus or minus 3 gigawatts, and why?
You're so pessimistic.
I know that. That's our job.
Yeah. So I haven't thought about this in terms of 2026. I'm going to frame this out in terms of 2030, which is the year that the state policymakers have really been thinking about, which is kind of a nice framework. It's about 10 years out. So here's what we know. 1,600 megawatts in Massachusetts, 2,400 megawatts in New York, and now 3,500 megawatts as of today in New Jersey, with another 368 megawatts, I think, in Maryland. So we see a really clear path there to something strongly in excess of 7,000 megawatts of demand up and down the U.S. Eastern Seaboard. And that's not counting some of the other states that have recently weighed in. Connecticut just today released a RFP for new sources of offshore wind in particular. Rhode Island still has demand on the books for offshore wind. Delaware did the first offshore wind PPA. So, in that area, literally every state between Massachusetts and Maryland has demand for offshore wind. Now, here's the interesting thing. All of those are demand targets within the next 10 years. Europe today has about 16,000 megawatts of offshore wind. It took Europe nearly 30 years to be able to build out 16,000 megawatts of offshore wind, and we have a very clear path to getting to half of that within the next 10 years. So, look, the U.S. takes a long time to get things right, but when we get things right, we will be the best in the world at it, and I believe the biggest market in the world for offshore wind.
It's difficult for me to second guess what other developers are going to do, what their strategies are and build outs, but certainly from our perspective, we believe by mid-2020s we have a good project here and we will be ready to deliver up to 1 gigawatt into the market there. New York wants it, we can deliver it.
Doreen?
Yeah, I think the 2026 timeframe is difficult. I agree with Clint in that regard, especially because of some of the supply chain needs that we have here in the U.S. today. It just means a longer time from signing on the dotted line to a project in the water, combined with obviously the permitting timelines that we have. That said, I completely agree with the 2030 horizon that Clint envisioned, and would say that, we, to conclude in New York, expect ourselves to be not only a leader with regard to the procurement and the acquisition of offshore wind, but also a hub for that industry. And that was a very important part of how we think about New York's role in all of this as a hub, given our geographic proximity between all of these states, given the resources that we have, and given the real opportunity that we've offered to the industry. I think what we'll see in 2030 is not just offshore wind of that magnitude, but also a very vibrant U.S. and New York industry supporting it.
Agree. And then just some final thoughts from myself along those lines. On that 2030 time horizon, I agree. I think there's a big difference when you look at 2026 versus 2030. If you looked at what we projected earlier, there's a clear ramp rate. And once you start to see the investment in terms of the supply chain, the infrastructure, once we actually have U.S. flagged vessels in the water, whether it be through a feeder mechanism and or a turbine installation vessel, when folks start to come down the learning curve, prices come down even further. There's an enormous amount of opportunity that exists, and it is a terribly exciting time. So definitely, I think there's high hopes that we'll see additional gigawatts in play once we get to the 2030 timeframe. So with that, I'd like to close. I'd like to thank our panelists so much for their time and insight today. Thank you very much, folks. And thanks so much And also, thanks so much for the audience today for your attention and also for your questions. I'm sorry I was not able to get to all of them, but we will be here following the close of this panel, and welcome folks to come up and continue the discussion. So again, thanks very much. Thanks to Clean Energy Connections. Thanks to the audience. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to everyone. Thanks so much. Take care.